I walked into the hospital thinking it would be like any other day, a routine visit, nothing out of the ordinary. The antiseptic hit me first, a sharp, clinical smell that somehow made the world feel both sterile and unreal. There was the constant, low hum of monitors and machines, a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic, like the building itself was breathing. At first, I didn't notice anything strange, but then I saw my parents. They were pacing back and forth near the reception, their faces tight, eyes darting between the nurse's station and the elevators, hands twisting and clenching in ways that screamed more than words ever could. I told myself it was just worry for my sister, her frail body lying somewhere beyond these walls. But even as I thought that, a nagging feeling crawled up my spine. Something was off. The way my father's jaw clenched when he spoke, the way my mother's foot tapped a nervous beat against the floor, it wasn't just worry. And yet, I smiled anyway, masking the unease, pretending everything was normal. I moved down the corridor, my shoes echoing softly against the polished floor, and tried to shake the feeling that a storm was gathering in this place. Little did I know, the calm I felt walking in was about to shatter completely. Visual cue. Slow tracking shot down the hospital corridor, lingering on the way hands gripped chairs and rails. Occasional cut to distant monitors beeping, sterile walls. Stretching into the background, subtle focus on the flicker of overhead fluorescent lights. Sitting in the waiting room, I tried to calm myself, to pretend this was just another ordinary day, but the unease from the corridor clung to me like a wet coat. The smell of coffee from the vending machine mixed oddly with the antiseptic, a strange attempt at comfort that only made my stomach twist. Around me, families whispered in low tones, the scrape of chairs against the linoleum floor echoing like tiny alarms. I noticed my parents again, huddled in a corner, speaking in clipped sentences, their voices low but urgent. I caught fragments. It has to happen. And something that sounded like he's the only one. My chest tightened that I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe they were just stressed. Maybe it was my imagination running wild. But the way my mother's fingers drummed against her knee, the way my father's eyes darted every few seconds, it didn't feel like ordinary stress. There was a calculation behind their worry, a precision that made my stomach churn. I found myself staring at them, trying to catch more words, but the whispers stopped as soon as I looked. My mind wouldn't stop spinning, pulling me into worst-case scenarios I didn't want to face that I gripped the armrest of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white, trying to ground myself. But it was like holding onto a raft in a storm. Every tick of the clock above the reception seemed louder than the last, each beep of the distant monitor a hammer against my ribs. I wanted to leave, to run out into the sunlight and forget whatever was building here. But something kept me glued to the seat, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and disbelief. A tiny part of me knew, before the words even came, that nothing would ever be the same after today. Then it happened. I heard it. My parents' voices, sharp, desperate, carrying across the sterile corridor in a way that made my blood run cold. Take his organ. Save our daughter. The words hit me like a punch I hadn't seen coming. Time slowed. I remember my stomach dropping, my heart hammering against my ribs, the world around me blurring into a haze of white walls and flickering lights. My sister lay somewhere beyond those doors, hooked to monitors and tubes, looking fragile and unaware, and yet somehow, in that instant, I felt like she was the center of a terrible storm that wasn't entirely about her, that I couldn't breathe properly. My mind looped over the words again and again, each repetition more unreal than the last. Did they really just say that? About me? I saw my father's face, twisted with something I couldn't name. Fear, desperation, but also calculation. And my mother, her eyes wide and frantic, nodding as if this was the only way to save their precious daughter. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped my bag. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something. Anything, but my body felt like it belonged to someone else, a stranger frozen in horror. Flashbacks hit me all at once. Every childhood moment, where I was the one who had to give up, who had to step aside, who had to follow orders without question. And now, those lessons came back to me like a cruel joke, love and loyalty twisted into something I couldn't recognize. The hospital, once a place of care, now felt like a cage, its sterile smell pressing in, the hum of machines suddenly sinister. I realized, in that gut-punched instant, that my world had fractured. I was standing in the same hallway, but everything I believed about my parents, about safety, about family, was shattered on the floor beneath my feet. I sank onto a cold plastic chair in the corner of the corridor, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The words echoed in my skull, each repetition sharper than the last. Take his organ. Save our daughter. I felt like I was drowning in disbelief, anger, and a sickening wave of betrayal. My parents, the people I had trusted above anyone else, suddenly seemed like strangers, calculating strangers willing to cross every moral line for the sake of their own child. My chest tightened, a painful squeeze, and my mind spun with conflicting thoughts. How could they? Didn't I matter at all? Haven't I given everything for this family? Flashbacks hit me like jagged shards. I remembered staying up late to comfort my sister when nightmares woke her, sacrificing my own opportunities so she could have more, hiding tears when she was upset so she wouldn't feel guilty. Every small act of love, every sacrifice, suddenly felt like it had been expected, almost transactional. And now, in this moment, I wondered if they had ever seen me as a person at all, or just as a means to an end. Anger mixed with sorrow, twisting in my stomach like a storm I couldn't control. And yet, amid the betrayal, there was another voice in my head, quieter but insistent. Protect her. Save her anyway, if you can. I felt torn, caught between instinct and morality. My body shook with the need to run, to escape this suffocating horror, but my mind wrestled with the memory of my sister's fragile form, hooked to machines, completely unaware of what had been discussed about me. I wanted to scream at them, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. I realized I was trapped in a moral labyrinth, forced to choose between self-preservation and the instinctive need to care for the sibling I loved. The corridor seemed endless, its white walls pressing in, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me. I felt smaller than ever, a lone figure in a world that had suddenly lost all sense of safety or certainty. Every heartbeat was deafening, each breath sharp and shallow, echoing the chaos inside me. And in that moment, I understood that nothing would ever feel the same again. The family I thought I knew had shown me a side I couldn't unsee, and I was left alone with the raw, twisting knot of fear, love, and betrayal that I couldn't sit still any longer. The words I'd overheard clawed at my chest until they burned, a hole I couldn't ignore. My legs felt heavy as I stood, but somehow I forced myself to walk down the corridor toward them. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, announcing a confrontation I wasn't prepared for but couldn't avoid. My voice cracked before it even found its strength. How could you even think of that? I asked, barely above a whisper. My throat felt raw, every word scraping against it like broken glass. They both froze. My mother's face snapped toward me first, her eyes wide, red from crying, but filled with a frantic intensity I'd never seen before. My father clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides, as if bracing for a blow. For a second, no one spoke, and the silence pressed down heavier than anything I'd ever felt. Then my mother's words spilled out, desperate, pleading. You don't understand. We have no choice. She's slipping away. This is the only way. To save her. Her voice cracked in the middle, but it wasn't enough to soften the edge of what she was really saying. That my chest heaved. No choice? You're talking about me. Like I'm just a body to carve open. Like I don't matter at all. My voice broke on the last word, and I hated how small and fragile it sounded. But it was all I had. My father finally spoke, his tone sharp, almost angry. It's about survival. She's our daughter, your sister. Don't you want to save her? The words cut deeper than anything else. The implication that my worth ended where hers began, that love meant sacrifice only when it came from me. Anger flared hot in my veins, so strong my hands trembled. I've been sacrificing my whole life. I shot back, my voice shaking. And now you want the last piece of me too? What's left after that? They looked at me with desperation, not cruelty, but it almost hurt worse. That they could justify this in their minds. That their fear had twisted into something that betrayed me so completely. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I turned my face away, choking on the sharp lump in my throat. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just their child anymore. I was their option, their solution, and I wasn't sure which was more unbearable, their willingness to use me, or the part of me that still loved them despite its I backed away from them, trying to catch my breath. Memories came crashing. In like an unstoppable tide, I was suddenly a child again, hiding under my bed while my sister cried in the next room, clutching a stuffed animal that smelled faintly of lavender. I remembered staying up late at night, whispering reassurances. I didn't feel, trying to calm her fears so she wouldn't wake my parents. Every sacrifice, every moment I put her needs before my own, suddenly flashed before my eyes like a slideshow of invisible debts that I saw myself giving up: birthday parties, homework help, even friendships, so that she could have more attention, more comfort, more love. I remembered how my parents would praise her achievements with bright smiles while my accomplishments were met with a polite nod or a tired sigh. And yet, I never complained. I had learned early that my role was to step back, to absorb the burden silently, to be the steady one behind the scenes. Every time I helped, every time I hid my own pain, I thought I was protecting the people I loved. But now, in the hospital corridor, those memories felt like chains. Every act of care, every selfless choice I had made was suddenly a preparation for this, the moment when my parents would see me not as a person, but as a resource, something expendable if it meant saving my sister. A bitter taste filled my mouth, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. I wanted to cry out, to scream at the child version of myself, telling him that none of this was fair. And yet, there was also tenderness. In those memories, I realized I had loved fiercely, without hesitation, without expectation of reward. That love had defined me, shaped me, and even now, despite the betrayal, it still burned quietly inside me. I couldn't undo the past, but I could recognize it, honor it, and maybe, just maybe, use it to guide my next choices. That I found myself alone in a quiet corner of the hospital, the hallway stretching endlessly before me, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I sank into a chair, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind spinning in circles I couldn't escape. The shock and betrayal from earlier had begun to dull, replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. I realized something vital. This wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about survival, for both my sister and myself. That I stared at the polished floor, tracing the faint reflections of overhead lights as my thoughts wandered. I had loved and sacrificed for years, and now that love had been weaponized against me. But sitting there, in that sterile silence, I understood that I couldn't let fear or anger control my actions. I had to think clearly. I had to find a way to navigate this nightmare without losing myself entirely. That a strange calm began to seep in, mingling with the lingering shock. I replayed the confrontation with my parents over and over in my mind, stripping it down to facts, setting aside emotion where I could. Yes, they had betrayed me. Yes, their desperation had pushed them to think in ways that were unimaginable. But I was still here. I still had choices. I still had agency. And for the first time that day, I realized that no one could take that away from me unless I allowed it. The hospital corridor seemed longer and emptier than ever, but I no longer felt completely trapped. Each breath, though shallow, grounded me, and I let my hands rest loosely in my lap instead of clenching them into fists. I felt the first flicker of strength, small but undeniable, and I told myself quietly, "You will protect her. You will protect yourself. And you will survive this." The clarity was fragile, but it was a lifeline, a first step toward reclaiming control in a situation that had threatened to swallow me whole. That I knew I couldn't face this alone. The weight of what I had overheard, the betrayal, and the moral storm swirling inside me, it was too much. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, the screen glowing harshly in the dim hospital light. Every number I dialed felt like a lifeline thrown into a churning sea. I hesitated, then finally spoke to someone who could intervene, a doctor I trusted, a counselor, anyone who would listen without judgment. My parents, my voice cracked before I could finish, a trembling whisper of disbelief and fear. I had to steady myself, had to force the words out. They want to use me to save my sister. Saying it aloud made the horror more real, but also somehow more manageable. The person on the other end listened, their voice calm but alert, validating my instincts without minimizing my fear. It was the first time someone acknowledged that what I was experiencing was not normal, not acceptable. Relief washed over me in small waves. I explained everything I remembered, every word I'd overheard, the desperation in my parents' voices, the history that had led to this moment. As I spoke, I felt a spark of empowerment, tiny, flickering, but unmistakable. I realized I wasn't powerless. I could take action, protect myself, and possibly protect my sister without being trapped in their moral calculus. Even in the midst of fear, I felt a sense of clarity settling over me. I could survive this. I could navigate this impossible situation with eyes wide open, and I could reclaim the agency that my parents' desperation had tried to strip away. For the first time since entering the hospital that day, I felt like I had a foothold, a way forward. I wasn't just the sacrificial child anymore. I was someone who could make decisions, someone who could act. I finally found myself by my sister's bedside, her fragile body barely moving under the thin hospital blanket. Machines beeped steadily, each sound a reminder of how close she was to slipping away and how precarious everything had become. She was too weak to understand what had just happened, too frail to realize that her parents had considered using me as a means to save her. But that didn't stop the wave of protectiveness crashing over me, fierce and unrelenting, that I took her hand in mine, marveling at how small and delicate it felt, and whispered to her anyway. "I've got you," I said softly, though she barely stirred. "I'm here. You don't have to worry." Even if she didn't understand the words, she could feel the intention, the quiet promise that I would be her shield. Flashbacks hit me again. Her laughter in the backyard, our late-night talks when the house was quiet, the moments we shared that I had cherished silently. All those memories strengthened a bond one realized was deeper than anything my parents' actions could sever. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. But this time, they weren't just for betrayal or heartbreak. They were for love. The love I had always carried quietly, fiercely, without expectation, and that now had a purpose of its own. It wasn't about sacrifice for them anymore. It was about care chosen freely, about protection born from connection, not obligation. I knew I couldn't undo the past or the shocking truth of my parents' intentions, but I could stand beside her, watch over her, and remind her, even silently, that she was not alone. For the first time that day, amidst hospital smells and the hum of machines, I felt something like hope. Not naive hope, not the kind that pretends everything is fine, but the kind rooted in action, in choice, in love that wasn't coerced. And as I held her hand, whispering softly, I realized that some bonds can't be broken, even when the people who should protect us most fail to do so. Weeks later, I stepped out of the hospital into the sunlight, the doors sliding shut behind me with a soft click that sounded like the end of a chapter one never wanted to live through. The air felt different, crisper, freer, almost impossibly bright after the sterile white corridors I'd spent so many hours in. I inhaled deeply, letting the warmth of the sun touch my face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a fragile but undeniable sense of freedom. That I thought about my parents, about the betrayal and desperation that had brought me to the brink, and a quiet acceptance settled over me. I may never forgive them fully, and perhaps I never will, but I had survived. I had taken action, protected my sister, and in doing so, protected myself. The experience had left scars, sure, but it had also shown me something crucial. My worth isn't determined by what others demand from me, nor by how far they're willing to go to serve their own ends. My worth comes from me, from the choices I make, and from the love I choose to give freely. Walking away from the hospital, I realized I had gained more than just survival. I had gained clarity, resilience, and a moral compass that no one could bend. Each step I took into the world outside felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd long forgotten. I wasn't the sacrificial child anymore. I was someone who could make decisions, someone who could act on conviction rather than coercion. And though the memory of that day would never leave me, it no longer had the power to define me. Yes, I turned the corner and walked down the sunlit street. I felt a quiet sense of closure, the kind that doesn't erase pain but transforms it into strength. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel, but I had emerged from the storm with my integrity intact, my love still intact, and the knowledge that I could survive anything life threw my way. The hospital doors were behind me, But the lessons, the love, and the resilience I had found there would stay with me forever.